At 7 in the morning I was jolted awake not by my alarm or the birds but by the sound of a furious pounding on my front door mixed with the screech of someone dragging something heavy across my driveway, and when I peeked through the blinds I nearly choked on my coffee because there was Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, red-faced and panting as she lugged a tangled orange extension cord that stretched across 3 lawns, screaming that my Tesla Charger was community property and that she had the right to power up her precious Lexus hybrid whenever she pleased. The scene was so absurd it felt like a prank show, yet there she was, standing with her free hand held up like a traffic cop, demanding I unlock my garage immediately while a couple of neighbors in bathrobes looked on in disbelief, one already holding up his phone to record. She was so convinced of her righteousness that she shouted she had called an emergency HOA enforcement, whatever that was supposed to mean, and that if I refused she would fine me for hoarding electricity. My mind whirled between wanting to laugh, wanting to yell, and wanting to crawl back into bed, but I knew this was only the beginning of something much larger, because with Karen, small squabbles always spiraled into neighborhood-wide wars. The day before had been normal enough. I had come home from work, parked my Tesla, plugged it into my wall charger, and gone inside to enjoy dinner with my wife. We had invested in solar panels last year, and after running the numbers, I realized we were saving hundreds every month compared to relying on the grid. To me it was both an environmental choice and a financial one, but to Karen it was apparently an insult. She had stopped me twice in the past week, questioning why I thought I deserved to be the only person in the neighborhood with a fancy free charger when she had to pay real money for gas. I had explained politely that it wasn't free, that I had paid for the panels and the charger installation myself, but she waved me off, muttering something about community resources. I thought it was just idle grumbling until she showed up at my door dragging that ridiculous cord. I stepped outside still in my pajamas, and before I could say a word Karen launched into a tirade about how the HOA bylaws guaranteed equal access to shared utilities. She waved a printed copy of the rules she had highlighted in neon pink, pointing at a line that, according to her, proved my garage outlet was part of the community. I glanced at it and had to stifle a laugh, because she had clearly misread a clause about the HOA maintaining the streetlights and storm drains. When I pointed that out, she huffed, planted her fists on her hips, and declared that electricity itself was a communal right. She even tried to guilt me, saying she was just trying to save the environment by charging her Lexus, even though everyone knew she mostly drove it to the salon and back. Behind her, a few more neighbors had gathered, drawn in by the commotion. They stood whispering and snickering, and I could feel the tension rising like static in the air. Karen then dramatically attempted to roll her Lexus up my driveway, though she had parked it awkwardly across both our lawns, nearly flattening my wife's flower bed in the process. She held her cord like a sword and demanded I do my civic duty by plugging it in. I calmly explained that not only was it unsafe, but it could damage both my charger and her vehicle. She scoffed and told me I was trying to use technical mumbo-jumbo to scare her. The sheer audacity would have been hilarious if it weren't also infuriating. I told her no firmly, and that should have been the end, but instead she stomped her foot and shouted that she would fine me. I reminded her she was not the HOA board, just one member, and she snapped back that she practically was the board. The neighbors erupted in laughter at that, which only fueled her anger further. Seeing that she wasn't getting her way, Karen tried a new tactic. She looked around at the gathering crowd and started yelling that I was selfish, that I thought I was better than everyone else because I drove a Tesla, and that I didn't care about helping others. She painted herself as the victim, claiming she couldn't afford the expensive gas prices and that I was hoarding electricity. It was such a performance that one neighbor whispered it felt like a bad courtroom drama. But then she took it further by threatening to call an emergency HOA meeting to vote on whether everyone could access my charger. The neighbors rolled their eyes, but I knew she was serious. Karen lived for these little power struggles, and she had a knack for twisting small issues into giant showdowns. I told her bluntly that if she so much as touched my charger without my permission, I would call the police. She gasped like I had just confessed to a crime and shouted to the neighbors that I was threatening her. I shook my head, realizing logic wasn't going to work here. Before the situation could get more heated, my wife stepped outside, calmly holding her coffee, and asked Karen why she was disturbing everyone so early in the morning. Karen immediately softened her tone, suddenly playing innocent, saying she was just trying to discuss community energy sharing. My wife raised an eyebrow and pointed to the giant orange cord trailing across multiple lawns and asked if that looked like a discussion or an invasion. The neighbors laughed again, some even applauding, which made Karen stomp her foot once more before storming off, shouting over her shoulder that she would see us all in the HOA meeting soon. I thought that might be the end of the morning's drama, but as I reeled in the memory of her red face and that ridiculous cord, I had the sinking feeling this was just the first act of a much bigger mess. Karen never backed down once she decided she was right. I could already see the storm clouds forming, the whispered conversations among neighbors, the phones recording for evidence or amusement, and the inevitable clash at the upcoming meeting. What had started as a demand to use my Tesla charger had now become a full-blown neighborhood spectacle, and if history with Karen had taught me anything, it was that she would escalate it until someone finally forced her to stop. Little did I know, her obsession with my charger would soon spiral so far out of control that it wouldn't just threaten our peace, but it would literally fry her own car and bring the entire neighborhood to the brink of chaos. Karen wasted no time after her dramatic extension cord stunt, because by that very evening she had called for what she proudly announced as an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers appeared on doors printed in bold black ink with her name at the bottom, as though she were the chairwoman of some federal committee instead of just a pushy neighbor with too much time on her hands. The flyer demanded all homeowners attend to discuss the issue of communal access to eco-friendly charging solutions, which was just her fancy way of saying she wanted to hijack my Tesla charger. By the time I read the paper, my wife was already shaking her head, muttering that Karen was about to turn a simple neighborhood annoyance into a neighborhood circus. I tried to ignore it, but by the next day at 7 in the evening, our HOA clubhouse was packed with curious residents, many of them secretly hoping for free entertainment. Karen stood at the front with a stack of papers and a smug grin, her Lexus key dangling like a badge of honor. She wasted no time, launching into a speech about fairness, equality, and the green energy revolution, as though she were delivering a State of the Union address. The ridiculous part was that she had highlighted random portions of the HOA bylaws again, claiming they gave her power to demand resource sharing. When someone asked what resources the HOA actually provided, she dodged the question and instead accused me of being a selfish hoarder who only cared about myself. The crowd was mixed between those who rolled their eyes and those who were too polite to speak up. I sat near the back, quietly taking notes, because I had learned long ago that Karen thrived when no one kept records of her nonsense. Halfway through her speech, she whipped out photos she had taken of my Tesla parked in the driveway, enlarged them on poster board, and dramatically declared that it represented inequality in our community. My jaw nearly hit the floor. She was presenting my car like it was some kind of villain in a propaganda poster. She claimed that while I luxuriated in free electricity, others suffered at gas pumps, and that it was the HOA's responsibility to equalize access. Someone coughed to hide their laughter, and another neighbor whispered that Karen had officially lost her mind. But she pressed on, proposing that all electric or hybrid owners should have access to my charger at any time, with me footing the bill since I had taken the first step. It was like watching a bad parody of a political debate. My wife raised her hand and calmly asked whether Karen had even considered the safety risks of letting multiple people plug random vehicles into my personal system. Karen puffed up like a blowfish and insisted she had done research on YouTube, proving it was safe. That drew a ripple of laughter, but Karen ignored it, moving straight to a motion to vote. A couple of her friends, the kind who always sided with her to avoid her wrath, raised their hands. But the majority of the room sat silent, clearly amused but not convinced. When no one else joined her side, Karen snapped that everyone was being bullied by me, and that she would personally take matters into her own hands. That was the moment I realized she was going to escalate beyond words, and sure enough, 2 days later she proved me right. It started small, with her wandering suspiciously near my driveway while I was at work. A neighbor texted me a photo of Karen crouched by my garage wall, as if she was trying to measure something. Then came the incident where she tried to run a cheap adapter from my outdoor outlet into her Lexus, which caused the breaker to trip and shut off half the power in my garage. My wife confronted her, pointing out that she had no right to even touch our property, but Karen responded by claiming the cord had simply fallen into the outlet by accident. Nobody believed her. That night, when I returned home, I found the charger slightly scuffed, as if someone had tried to force a plug into it. It was then I decided to start documenting everything with cameras. I set up a discreet security camera facing the charger, certain it would catch her in the act sooner or later. It did not take long. One evening around 9, while I was relaxing with a book, the garage lights flickered. I rushed out only to find Karen half inside my garage, holding some off-brand charging adapter that looked like it came from a dollar store. She froze when she saw me, then shouted that she was conducting an inspection to prove I was violating HOA rules. I told her she was trespassing and needed to leave immediately. She refused, fumbling with her adapter until sparks actually flew from the outlet. The smell of burnt plastic filled the air, and she screamed, dropping the device as smoke curled from the socket. My wife grabbed her phone and snapped a picture while I rushed to cut the breaker. Karen stood there coughing, her face pale but still defiant, insisting it was my fault for not properly labeling my equipment. She then stormed off, swearing she would report me to the fire marshal. The next morning, half the neighborhood knew what had happened. The videos from my security camera had already circulated in a private group chat, showing Karen nearly setting my garage ablaze. Neighbors who once ignored her now openly mocked her. Some even started calling her Sparky behind her back. That only fueled her anger further. She began marching up and down the street, ranting about how dangerous Teslas were and how the government needed to regulate chargers. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't also disturbing to watch her obsession grow. In the middle of all this, Karen's Lexus began showing signs of damage. She complained loudly at the next HOA coffee gathering that her dashboard had started glitching and her hybrid battery was acting funny. She tried to pin the blame on me, insisting my selfish refusal had forced her to experiment with alternate charging methods that were harming her car. People tried to explain that she was the one plugging into random outlets with cheap adapters, but she ignored them. Instead, she doubled down, saying she was now more determined than ever to make my charger open for everyone. That night, I spotted her circling my driveway in her Lexus, staring at my garage with the intensity of a general plotting a siege. At this point, even those who once tolerated her antics began distancing themselves. One neighbor whispered to me that Karen was the kind of person who could set fire to her own car and still find a way to blame someone else. I nodded grimly, because I suspected that was exactly where this was headed. With each failed attempt to use my charger, her desperation grew. And as I checked the scorched outlet in my garage, replaced the breaker, and reinforced my security system, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the warm-up act. Karen had tasted humiliation, and knowing her, she would rather burn everything down before admitting defeat. Little did I realize that her next move would not only risk her Lexus, but would drag the entire neighborhood into a showdown that none of us would ever forget. By the time the chaos of Karen's garage stunt had begun to fade from everyone's conversations, I thought maybe she had finally realized how reckless she had been, but I should have known better because Karen never retreated when she smelled the faintest chance of control. Instead, she began turning her crusade into something she framed as noble, as if she was some sort of champion for energy fairness. It started with a flyer she stuck into everyone's mailbox, covered in bold slogans about how green energy belongs to all of us, and no neighbor should be left behind in the eco-movement. She conveniently left out the part where her Lexus had been coughing smoke after her last failed attempt at using my charger, but she paraded around the street with a clipboard, asking people to sign a petition for mandatory community access to my garage. At first, neighbors just chuckled and avoided her, but soon the constant knocking on doors, the long speeches in driveways, and her fake statistics started to irritate everyone. She claimed 90% of homeowners believed in sharing chargers, though it was obvious she pulled that number from thin air. Her obsession turned into a spectacle one afternoon when my wife invited a licensed electrician over to inspect the damage Karen's tinkering had caused in our garage. The man walked through the setup, shook his head, and explained in plain terms why plugging random vehicles into someone else's system was dangerous. He described how different voltage requirements could fry a car's battery, even start fires, and how Karen's adapters were disasters waiting to happen. A few neighbors gathered to listen, grateful for actual expertise, and nodded along. But Karen, who had been lurking nearby like a shadow, stormed over and began arguing with the electrician, accusing him of being in my pocket and working for Tesla. He calmly pulled out diagrams, showed her amperage numbers, and even pointed to the scorched marks on my wall as evidence. Instead of accepting the truth, Karen shouted that science had been wrong before and that she had her own research. The electrician finally gave up, muttering under his breath about stubborn fools, while Karen announced to everyone that the man was part of a conspiracy to keep electric power in the hands of the wealthy. Not long after that embarrassing scene, Karen tried her most brazen stunt yet. One evening, while I was grilling in the backyard, I heard a strange humming noise from the garage. I rushed in, only to find her Lexus parked half inside my driveway with a suspicious splitter device dangling from my charger. She had apparently bought some kind of knockoff connector online and jammed it into my equipment, splicing it with her own cable to her Lexus. The sight of that rigged contraption made my stomach drop because it looked like a bomb made of wires and duct tape. Before I could even reach for the breaker, sparks flew and her Lexus headlights began flashing wildly like a disco show. Karen sat behind the wheel, grinning like she had discovered gold, until the smell of burning rubber filled the air. Then, without warning, her entire dashboard went dark, and the car let out a loud pop followed by smoke seeping from the vent. She screamed, yanked the cable out, and stumbled out of the car coughing. I killed the power and called over a neighbor who was already recording the scene with his phone. Karen immediately switched from bravado to tears, shrieking that I had sabotaged her Lexus and that I would pay for damages. The neighbors, tired of her antics, laughed openly and reminded her she had been told multiple times not to touch my equipment. The aftermath of that disaster spread fast. Videos of Karen's Lexus smoking in my driveway made the rounds in our community chat within hours. By the next morning, half the neighborhood had seen her meltdown, including the part where she screamed that her civil rights had been violated by private charging stations. Instead of retreating in shame, she doubled down again, holding her head high and walking around as though she was the victim of some government experiment. At the next impromptu HOA discussion in the clubhouse, she stood up and delivered a tearful speech about being oppressed, claiming she had been forced to jury-rig solutions because I refused to share. She went as far as accusing me of intentionally booby-trapping my charger to hurt her. The room erupted into chaos, with people laughing, others shaking their heads, and a few trying to calm her down. When I took the floor and calmly showed both the electrician's written report and the video footage from my security camera, it was obvious to everyone who was lying. Karen shouted that the footage was fake, that I had hired an actor to play the electrician, and that deep fakes were destroying America. The absurdity was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But as funny as her paranoia was, there was also a simmering danger underneath. Karen was losing face, and she hated nothing more than being laughed at. Her desperation to prove she was right was beginning to override any common sense she had left. That was when she made her boldest claim yet. She cornered a group of neighbors and told them she had evidence that my charger was illegally installed, that I hadn't followed city codes, and that soon inspectors would come to shut me down. It was nonsense, of course, since I had all the permits and receipts, but she spread the rumor like wildfire. For a few days, some people even asked me nervously if her story was true. I showed them my paperwork, which silenced the doubts, but Karen used those moments to fuel her narrative that I was some kind of arrogant rule-breaker. Meanwhile, her Lexus continued to suffer. After the botched charging attempt, its battery warning lights flickered constantly, and she was seen stranded twice at the grocery store parking lot, waving jumper cables like a flag of surrender. Neighbors who had once tolerated her started avoiding eye contact, not wanting to get dragged into another tirade about electricity right. Still, she would not let go of her obsession. One evening, I caught her pacing up and down the sidewalk outside my home, muttering to herself about calling the fire department again, then scribbling notes into a notebook. It was unsettling to watch, like she was plotting a military campaign. It all came to a head at another HOA meeting when Karen, instead of presenting her usual stack of half-baked flyers, slammed down what she called a proposal for energy democracy. She argued that all chargers, outlets, and solar panels in the neighborhood must be considered community property. People burst out laughing, some asking sarcastically if that meant they could also use her pool and kitchen. She turned beet red, screamed that nobody was taking her seriously, and threatened to sue the HOA for discrimination if they didn't enforce her demands. The board president calmly reminded her that my charger was on private property, fully permitted, and beyond the scope of HOA authority. Karen refused to accept that answer and stormed out of the meeting, shouting that everyone would regret ignoring her. The breaking point came one late Saturday afternoon, when Karen's obsession finally boiled over into something that could have burned the whole neighborhood down. I had just come back from a quick trip to the hardware store, pulling into my driveway and unloading a few bags of supplies when I smelled something sharp and acrid in the air. It was the unmistakable odor of scorched plastic mixed with smoke, and before I even turned toward my garage I heard the sound of frantic shouting. Rushing forward, I found Karen standing half inside my property again, clutching a mangled extension cord that was sparking violently against the wall outlet, her Lexus angled in my driveway with its hood slightly ajar and smoke curling out of the front vent. Her face was twisted with panic, yet even as sparks flew and neighbors began rushing toward the scene with phones out and garden hoses ready, she kept yelling that this was all my fault, that if I had simply shared as I was supposed to none of this would have happened. I cut the breaker immediately while my wife called the fire department, and within minutes the wail of sirens echoed down the street. The sheriff's deputy, the fire marshal, and even 2 city code inspectors ended up in my yard, while half the neighborhood gathered around as though it were the climax of a play they had been watching for weeks. The fire marshal was the first to address the situation. He shook his head, bent down to inspect the scorched outlet, then turned to Karen and asked why she had been messing with equipment that clearly wasn't hers. Karen puffed up with her usual righteous indignation and said she was exercising her community rights, that I had been hoarding electricity, and that she had no choice but to act. The deputy raised an eyebrow, clearly suppressing a laugh, and asked if she understood the difference between personal property and shared resources. She tried to wave a highlighted copy of the HOA guidelines again, insisting she was justified, but the code inspector flatly told her the HOA had no authority over private electrical installations. The crowd of neighbors erupted in whispers and chuckles, some filming openly, and Karen's face went red as she realized her grand argument was collapsing. She pointed a finger at me, shouting that I had set her up, that I had deliberately wired my charger in a way that would electrocute her car. The fire marshal simply gestured at the melted cord she had brought from her own garage and said plainly that she had caused this herself. The deputy then warned her that if she tampered with my property again, she could be arrested for trespassing and reckless endangerment. But the humiliation didn't end there. The very next evening, the HOA scheduled a full meeting to discuss the incident since so many residents had witnessed it. The clubhouse was packed to capacity, every chair filled and people standing in the back with arms crossed, clearly anticipating drama. Karen marched in wearing a blazer and pearls, as though dressing formally would give her authority, and slammed a stack of papers on the table. She wasted no time launching into a speech about corruption, elitism, and unfair treatment, pointing at me with every other sentence. She accused me of monopolizing eco-resources, of endangering the neighborhood by refusing to share, and even went as far as suggesting that Tesla owners like me believed we were superior to everyone else. Her voice shook with fury, and for a moment I thought she might actually cry, but then she switched gears and began shouting that the HOA board had failed its members by allowing me to deny her access. She demanded a vote that very evening to require open access to any chargers or solar power sources in the community. When it was my turn to respond, I stood calmly, pulled out my folder of receipts, permits, electrician reports, and even still images from my security cameras showing Karen tampering with my garage. I laid them on the table for everyone to see. My voice was steady as I explained how I had paid for every component out of my own pocket, followed all city codes, and how dangerous it was for anyone to use my system without authorization. Then I played a short clip from the camera showing Karen plugging her mangled cord into my outlet, sparks flying, and her Lexus headlights flickering wildly. The room erupted in laughter and gasp. Karen shrieked that the footage was fake, that it had been doctored, but by then her credibility was crumbling. The HOA president calmly reminded everyone that property rights were crystal clear, that no one could be forced to share private utilities, and that any further tampering would lead to heavy fines and possibly legal charges. What happened next was a sight I will never forget. For the first time in years, the HOA board took a unanimous vote not only to dismiss Karen's proposal but to formally fine her for dangerous behavior and for endangering the community with unauthorized electrical tampering. They set the fine at a few $1,000s, enough to sting, and announced that any future violations would result in legal escalation. The room erupted in applause. Neighbors who had been quietly seething for months now openly cheered. Some clapped me on the back, others laughed at the absurdity of it all, and even the usually silent HOA treasurer smirked as Karen stormed to her feet, veins bulging in her forehead. She screamed that everyone would regret this, that she was being persecuted, and that she would sue the board, sue me, and sue the city if necessary. Her rant lasted a solid 5 minutes, during which she knocked over a chair and slammed her papers onto the floor before storming out of the clubhouse, her heels clattering dramatically against the tile. As she stomped down the sidewalk outside, still shouting about lawsuits and corruption, the neighbors poured out behind her, some shaking their heads and others laughing openly. Someone whispered that it was like watching the villain in a reality show lose during the season finale, and the comparison was too perfect. For a moment I allowed myself to feel relieved. It seemed like the nightmare was finally over, that the board had shut her down and the law had warned her off. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She was too proud, too stubborn, and too blinded by her own sense of entitlement. If anything, the public humiliation and the fine would only push her to go further, to prove everyone wrong in some grand, reckless gesture. Sure enough, later that week, several neighbors reported seeing Karen meeting with some shady-looking electrician near her garage late at night. The man's truck bore no company logo, and the equipment he hauled in looked like it had seen better days. Word spread quickly that Karen had hired someone off the books to help her bypass her problem, to find a way to hardwire her Lexus directly into my charger circuit without my knowledge. The idea was ludicrous, but with Karen nothing was out of the question. I began to sleep with one ear open, checking my cameras constantly, waiting for the next explosion. My wife warned me that the woman was on the verge of snapping entirely, and I agreed. All the signs were there. Her obsession had gone beyond a feud. It had become a personal crusade, one she was willing to risk everything on. I should have trusted my instincts that night when I saw Karen pacing outside her garage with that strange electrician, because what unfolded in the days that followed was the kind of chaos you only ever expect to see in a slapstick movie or a nightmare you wake up laughing about, except this was real, and it was dangerous. After the HOA meeting had ended with her storming out humiliated, most of the neighbors assumed that was the finale of Karen's drama, but she was not the kind of person who could quietly lick her wounds. Instead, she decided to stage her most daring move yet. Late one Thursday evening, when most of the neighborhood was either asleep or winding down for the night, Karen and her hired help began sneaking around my property like characters in a bad crime drama. My cameras caught them crouched near the side of my garage, tools in hand, trying to splice into my charger's conduit as though they were running some kind of underground heist. The man worked quickly, attaching ugly cables and wiring directly into her Lexus, while Karen stood there holding a flashlight like she was the director of some secret mission. Watching the footage later, I couldn't believe the sheer recklessness of it, but at the time, I only knew something was wrong when I heard the faint sound of humming outside my window, followed by a sharp pop and the smell of ozone filling the air. By the time I rushed outside, the scene was like something out of a disaster film. Karen's Lexus was sitting in my driveway connected to the jury-rigged wires, its lights flickering erratically, the dashboard lighting up and dying over and over, while smoke curled out from beneath the hood. The shady electrician was backing away slowly, clearly realizing he had made a mistake, but Karen stood proudly, arms crossed, grinning like a queen who had finally claimed her crown. She shouted over the crackling sparks that I could no longer deny her access, that her Lexus was now officially running on my charger, and that the HOA would have to bow to her victory. I barely had time to shout at her to cut the connection when a loud bang erupted from the car, a sound like a firecracker going off in a metal box. The Lexus shuddered violently, its alarm blaring before the entire system went dead. Thick smoke poured from the vents, the smell of burning wires filled the air, and Karen's smug grin evaporated into a shriek. She jumped back, waving her hands in the air, while the electrician bolted down the street without a word. The commotion drew half the neighborhood out of their houses in minutes. People came running with phones out, filming the chaos as Karen wailed that I had booby-trapped my charger, that I had destroyed her Lexus intentionally. But the evidence told a different story. Sparks still hissed from the mangled wires she and her hired help had connected, the plastic casings melted into charred lumps, and the smell of fried circuits was unmistakable. My wife had already called the fire department, and within minutes flashing lights bathed the street once again as firefighters and another sheriff's deputy arrived to assess the damage. The deputy listened calmly as Karen spun her tale of sabotage, waving her arms dramatically and trying to look like the victim, but then he turned to me and asked for my security footage. I handed over the USB drive I had prepared, knowing this day might come, and within moments he was watching clear video of Karen and her so-called electrician tampering with my property. The look on his face said it all. He told Karen plainly that what she had done was illegal, dangerous, and could have easily burned down more than just her car. Neighbors crowded around, some laughing openly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One of them, always the joker of the block, shouted that Karen's Lexus had finally gone hybrid between gasoline and barbecue. Even the firefighters cracked smiles as they hosed down the smoking remains of the car's front end. Karen screamed at them all to stop laughing, tears streaking her cheeks, but she couldn't silence the chorus of chuckles and muttered nicknames, everything from Sparky to Smoke Queen. When the deputy informed her she would be cited for trespassing, tampering with electrical property, and reckless endangerment, her face went pale, and for the first time in this entire saga, she seemed to realize she had gone too far. Still, she tried to sputter out excuses, claiming she had been tricked by the electrician, that she had only been doing what was fair for the community, but nobody bought it anymore. The following week was like living in the aftermath of a storm. Karen's Lexus was towed away, its battery fried beyond repair, and rumors swirled about how much it would cost her to fix. Some said 10,000, others said more, but either way, it was enough to sting badly. The HOA officially stripped her of her role on the board, citing her repeated violations and reckless behavior. For once, the board didn't even try to soften the blow. They simply announced her removal at the next meeting and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Neighbors clapped politely, some even clapped enthusiastically, and Karen sat in the corner scowling, her hair frazzled and her pride shattered. She tried to protest, but the board president silenced her with a single sentence, reminding her that her fines and damages now exceeded anything the HOA had ever dealt with before. That moment was the final nail in her coffin as the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. As for me, I installed a steel lockbox around my Tesla Charger, complete with a coded padlock, just to prevent any further tampering. I even hired a professional security company to add motion sensors, so if anyone so much as looked at my Charger the wrong way, I would get an alert. My wife and I laughed about it privately, joking that we had built the Fort Knox of electric vehicle charging stations. But beneath the humor there was relief, because the nightmare was finally over. Karen had gone as far as she possibly could, and she had lost spectacularly. She had been fined, humiliated, stripped of her influence, and left with a smoldering Lexus that served as the perfect symbol of her downfall. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood atmosphere lightened considerably. People who had been cautious or nervous began laughing about the saga openly, recounting their favorite moments like they were highlights from a comedy show. Some loved the footage of her dragging the extension cord across 3 lawns, others quoted her speech about energy democracy in exaggerated voices, and nearly everyone agreed that the grand finale of her Lexus frying itself was the perfect poetic justice. Kids drew chalk pictures on the sidewalk of Tesla's zapping Lexuses with lightning bolts, while adults toasted to a Karen-free HOA barbecue. Even the HOA board, normally stiff and formal, cracked jokes about installing a plaque near the clubhouse commemorating the Great Charger Wars. Karen herself retreated into bitterness. She still lived in the neighborhood, but she walked with her head down, muttering under her breath, avoiding the eyes of those who once tolerated her. Occasionally she tried to spread new rumors, claiming she was preparing a lawsuit or that she had contacts in government ready to investigate me, but nobody paid her any mind anymore. The spectacle had burned her credibility beyond repair. She became more isolated with each passing day, while the rest of us enjoyed the peace she had once disrupted so loudly.